For anyone who's been following my channel for a while, it will come as no surprise that one of the subjects I feel strongest about is crime, justice and sentencing. And I made that video recently about the new crime bill and my thoughts on the penalty for statue vandalism being heavier, ostensibly, than the penalty for sexual crimes and violent assault, and crimes I would argue are more serious. Um, if the Tories are pushing a harder line on crime, that's a good thing. That's what they're supposed to be. They are the Conservative Party. They're supposed to be the party of law and order. But I think they're getting the priority wrong on that. Um, there's a lot of things to say about the subject. Let me just say from the outset, I won't lie. I'm not balanced on this, or rather, I'm not neutral on the subject. Um, I'm conservative on crime, not necessarily party conservative. I I don't usually vote Tory. Well, in fact, I don't vote Tory. But ideologically, I'm conservative on crime. There's no point denying it. Um, I'm liberal, left wing on other areas. I am centrist in most issues. But when it comes to crime, I have no problem saying I am conservative. I think the people who hurt society have to pay a price. And I find myself quite frustrated with some of the arguments coming from the liberal left about the subject. Um, so I'm going to pontificate for a while, and people can leave counter opinions or counter views, but this is the way I see it. If we look at the UK, I'll just focus on the UK because there is different contexts around the world. And by the way, the UK actually has very low crime rates, at least homicide rates. It might be higher in other crimes, but the homicide rate of this country is very low. And that's something I think the press have to remind people of and be responsible about. If I do have one criticism of right wing tabloids when it comes to crime, I do think they scaremonger sometimes with particularly heinous crimes. So it is important to bear in mind that the chances of being murdered in the United Kingdom are very, very low. We had less than 1,000 homicides at the last when the last statistics were available, which I think was 2018. Now, for a country of 68 million, that's a very low rate. Compare that to Honduras or Eswatini in southern Africa and many other countries, particularly in Central America, but also in parts of Africa, then you'll see some context. I think that's important. Um, you sort of get two schools of thought here. You have like the really liberal left school that really love to promote the Nordic system. Well, there's a few problems with that. Firstly, British society is very different from Norwegian or Swedish society. We're Western countries and we have that in common. We're Western democracies, we're liberal democracies. But I do think there is a different public attitude. Um, they really like to promote that system. Oh, look at their nice, wonderful prisons, or they lock much fewer people up and therefore they've got lower crime rates. Well, actually, the crime rates in Sweden are recorded in a different way. So this idea that there's sort of these peaceful utopias where there are no crime is false. In fact, Sweden has quite a serious problem with gang violence, particularly in migrant communities. That's not scaremongering. There's empirical evidence for that. It's still a lot safer than many parts of Central America, but this, liberal left argument. Oh, well, look at Sweden. Look at how safe it is. Well, I could easily make the argument. Okay, what about Japan? Japan is a country that picked a very hard line on crime, and they have arguably the lowest crime rates in the world for a major country. So how does that figure into your logic? If you're saying that only the liberal approach works, that kind of counters the Japanese model, which again, any of these things is going to have pros and cons. One thing I'm a little bit wary of in the Japanese system is with the death penalty, there's a lot of shadiness around that. They only inform people on the day that they're being executed, which I think is a bit harsh on the family of the condemned. But it's irrefutable that Japan is a country with very low violent crime rates. So, I never see liberal lefties use the Japan model. Why not? Um, Clearly, we don't want a situation where people are just locked up and that's it. But I honestly care more about prison being effective than the number of people in prison. If bad people are in prison and not on the streets, that's a good thing. There will always be crime. We're never going to have a situation where there's no crime. But, you know, I think the focus needs to be on what happens inside, how prison is run, that sort of thing. I do believe there are some people, given half a chance, take, for example, the Green Party of England and Wales. I honestly believe, given half a chance, they would seriously consider closing all prisons, which to me would not only be wrong, morally speaking, because it would be allowing dangerous people out, but it would be reckless for that reason. That would be an insane idea. I don't think politically they're stupid enough to propose that, but I think that they would like to if they got away with it. Because if you look at the Greens' attitude to crime on their manifesto, the last manifesto, they literally said, we are against the concept of punishment. So that's something I find hard to stomach. Thankfully, it's a minority view. Most British people, they're not. I would honestly say of my compatriots, the majority of people just want to see justice. People aren't bloodthirsty. They don't want to see, public executions or something like that. But most people do want to see justice. And I think there is an overwhelming sense of lack of trust in the system. And I have long believed this is because judges aren't accountable enough and there is a lack of democracy. Now, I'm not proposing that we just put a vote to the public on every punishment. But I do think there needs to be more transparency and judges have to personally be more accountable. I've long believed that, and I believe it even more now. Uh, but regarding punishment, there's a lot of distortion around this because the liberal left, and that's kind of an umbrella term I'm using. I know it's not ideal, but for the sake of simplicity, the liberal left's idea is that people who talk tough on crime, like myself, oh, it's just to sound tough. It's just punitive. It's just no, no, and no. It's not about sounding tough. It's because it's the right thing to do. If someone hurts society, if they hurt a vulnerable person, especially, the idea that they shouldn't be punished to me is morally perverse and it's nonsensical. Um, and it's not practical. Leave aside morality, it isn't practical because if you get some thug who beats up a homeless person or rapes a woman at knife point or is part of a gang that leaves someone in hospital, those sort of evil, destructive crimes, um, they're not going to do it once, they will do it again. That's why it's not just a moral issue, it's also a practical one. Dangerous people belong behind bars. And frankly, people who cannot see that or they try to argue against it, I think they need their head examined, to put it bluntly. I don't equivocate on this. I have very strong views on it, and it's not a case of wanting to just throw them in and throw away the key. Obviously, there has to be due process. I also strongly believe in that. We need a system where all the evidence is presented so there's no miscarriages of justice, which is a terrible thing. But behind bars, what should prison be like? It should serve a purpose other than punishment. I agree with that. It shouldn't just be like they're sitting in their cell all day, bored out of their mind, and that just makes them resentful and hateful of society. There should be purposes in prison. I think there's a lot of things that inmates can do from prison that's productive for society. Manufacturing, perhaps. There could be a lot of other areas. Perks, I think for lower level inmates, that might be something, but I don't think that high level inmates should enjoy the privileges, or rather the rights that people have on the outside. Um, I think there's definitely has to be certain limitations that people on the outside don't have because there is a difference, obviously. Um, but the liberal left love to focus on this word rehabilitation. Oh, well, let's forget punishment. Let's focus on rehabilitation. What I would argue is they're both important. It's not one or the other. The liberal left think that punishment is punitive. They cannot get into their heads that there is a purpose to that. It's a consequence for an action. And I do get very, very frustrated with their mentality. Um, let's not punish them, let's just rehabilitate them. Yes, let's rehabilitate them after they've been punished, after they've served time for what they have done. Then the way to do it is to see if they are fit for society, to see if they're really remorseful, to see if they really are fit to be rehabilitated. And the rehabilitation process can maybe begin inside. I'm not against that. So by no means am I against the concept of rehabilitation. I just question those who think it should come first and foremost. Punishment is the most obvious thing. When someone's sentenced, the punishment factor has to come first, and then other things follow. The rehabilitation follows. Of course, rehabilitation is important because without it, you have a situation where the inmate's just bitter and hateful of the world because they haven't got in themselves to think that they put themselves in that position. Well, no, they've just had their freedom lost and they've, served hard time. Obviously, they're going to be angry. That's where rehabilitation comes in, preparing them for the outside world, preparing them for a law-abiding life, that sort of thing. I'm totally for that. Um, but I really would, push back against this idea that punishment is about revenge or it's punitive. If punishment was about revenge, I mean, if justice was about revenge, that would mean that exactly the same thing happens to the criminal as happens to the victim. So if you really believe this nonsense that punishment is revenge, then let's say, for example, you had a thug rape a woman at knife point, then revenge would be the thug is raped at knife point, which we wouldn't do and we shouldn't do because we should be a civilized society. We can't reduce ourselves to the level of the criminal. That's why I'm not a fan of vigilantism. I would always speak against it, even on the inside. Even on the inside. The reason I'm against it on the inside is because, you can't have a situation where the armed robber beats up the paedophile. Oh, he's suddenly a hero. No. All I see is one bad guy beating up another bad guy. And one of them is maybe worse than the other, but they're both bad guys. So this idea of prison vigilantism, having a blind eye turned to it or something, I think when you start having a situation where inmates take over, that's anarchy. And I know maybe it's very naive to assume that that's going to change anytime soon. I think there is a real culture in prison that's, I've watched enough documentaries to have some insight into this. It's a cultural thing and it's not easy to change, but maybe employing more prison staff, maybe the way they're trained, there's a lot of different things to look at with that. So in that sense, I'm totally for penal reform. I don't think there's any merit in having inhumane conditions. For example, when you have four people to a cell that's 4-2, that sort of thing. And I mean, you look at parts of the world where prisons are like human battery farms, and that is horrendous. Um, so we don't want a situation like that. So why not seriously consider the prospect of building new prisons? It sounds kind of Scrooge-like. Oh, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? But actually, if you break it down, the problem now is overcrowding, right? But that's not because too many people are locked up. It's because we don't have enough prison space. That's the issue. So let's consider building more prisons. There'll be a cost to it. There's a cost to everything. But with that, you have less pressure on prison staff because they've got fewer numbers to handle, and less pressure on inmates themselves. An inmate who's sharing with one person is going to be less volatile than an inmate who's sharing with three people. That goes without saying. So I do think it needs to be seriously considered. I know there's a few more that have been built, but I would argue for even more to balance out the system so that it isn't overburdened. Of course, there's a cost to it. There's a cost to everything, and it wouldn't be in urban areas because people would complain. I would suggest remote areas, far from people. Um, why not? And no, I'm not talking about a British gulag. They would be humane. They would be, they'd have to be modern, humane conditions. But I think it should be seriously looked at. Um, Finally, I think each case should be looked at on its own merit. Obviously, there's a trajectory, and I often talk about, weak judges issuing pathetic sentences, and I do think there's a trajectory of that. I accept that each case needs to be looked at on its own merit. Um, One of my subscribers said that judges perhaps issue softer sentences, not quite the words he used, but because of the fear of overcrowding. Well, that's deeply alarming if that's the case, and if it's possible. Because, the idea that a violent person could escape prison just because they might add to the numbers, that shouldn't be enough of a reason not to face justice. I think that's preposterous, because that isn't, it might be having one less person in the system, but it also means it's one more person roaming the streets. So I really take, I am quite strongly resentful of those who really are vocally anti-prison. If that's their position, they should be the ones to pick up the pieces. They should be the ones to have to deal with criminals terrorizing housing estates, terrorizing the public. Um, I think rehabilitation is extremely important. I'm not downplaying it. I think it should come after punishment, or at least be part of the process. But punishment must be a factor. Um, Finally, well, don't think there is a finally. I've more or less said what I want to say. That's it. I just think that no victim of crime, wherever their politics, will want a situation where dangerous people are free. Some of them might disagree on the exact consequences, but there has to be a situation where there is consequences. There has to be. This idea that punishment is punitive is moronic. It's stupid. It's ignorant. And in my view, it's just plain wrong. Punishment is not punitive. Punishment on its own, granted, might be punitive, but punishment coupled with rehabilitation, coupled with penal reforms, has a purpose. The punishment factor is consequence for action. Even the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, which is a body that I'm very critical of, even they acknowledge punishment has a purpose. So I am very suspicious of people who have this knee jerk reaction against punishment because they seem to care more about the criminal than they do about the victim. That sickens me. And it's something I've got no respect for. Um, anyway, that's that. I don't claim I'm completely 100% right about this, but I know what I believe, and I think the majority of the public in this country, they're not hardcore conservatives, they're not hardcore flog 'em and hang 'em, but I do think most people. That's why I don't think the Swedish model could ever work in this country. I think the public would reject it. I really do. Um, in my opinion. Right. Thanks for watching.